we have Gina, the head of creative at Captify, Gabi, the head of product at Scope3, and then once again, Andy's joining to discuss how to drive sustainability in your creatives. So I know this is a big initiative, sustainability. It's a big buzzword in the industry, so they will be diving into this now. And I'll let you guys take it away.
Thanks, Kelly. So welcome everyone to our fireside chat on sustainability. It's a fireside chat that's so sustainable. We don't have a fire, but we do have the two expert guests. Gabi from Scope3, who are at the forefront of measuring sustainability impact of advertising, and Gina from Captify, who provides search intelligence technology whilst also focusing on sustainability. So let's start with some introductions. Gabi, could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about Scope3 and how the company came about?
Yeah, of course. So I'm actually head of product for creative and production at Scope3. I'm not overall head of product. I've been at the company for about a year, and Scope3, as you mentioned before, our job is measuring the emissions associated with advertising and supporting brands and agencies and all of our partners in decarbonizing themselves in time for the decarbonization that needs to happen across industry. There's a bit of background. Scope3 was actually set up by a group of tech veterans, including Brian O'Kelly, about 3 years ago. And that was as a result of, at the time, they were working in trying to map supply chain, like physical supply chains. And obviously Brian's background is ad tech. And there was a lot of conversation about, well, what does the supply chain look like in ad tech? Could we work out how we could decarbonize that supply chain when we have so much expertise in that area, especially that with, the redundancy and waste that lives inside of media and the emissions that are caused by that. So that was what sort of became the inception of Scope3. And now, after 3 years of work and a rapidly expanding team, which I can talk more about later on in our session, they now have, I believe, one of the most comprehensive models for mapping the industry emissions across all of the digital media landscape so far.
Great, thanks. And then Gina, could you introduce yourself and just share a bit about Captify and your role there?
I can. Good morning. Well, that's not a good start. Good afternoon. So I'm Gina, and within my role, I look after our creative studio globally at Captify. I've been within the role for about 5 years now, but with about 10 plus years in the industry. But as Joe said previously, it feels like it's been about 100 years. And just to give you guys, for those of you who aren't familiar with Captify, a little bit of information about who Captify are. We are essentially the largest holder of on-site search data outside of the walled gardens. So essentially, Captify helps brands understand consumer interests, their moments, and their mindsets. And through that search behavior, it provides a view into consumer intent, which is then made actionable. And we use that search intelligence to help fuel flexible omnichannel solutions to bring brands new real-time audiences, but also publishers a greater yield. And then I guess most importantly, consumers the most relevant digital advertising experience. And then from a creative perspective, our in-house creative studio, which I kind of look after, leverages the power of that real-time search data to fuel creative activations. And this basically results in personalized advertising experiences that drive better performance. And by tapping into, those consumer interests, the studio team can then create, with Scope3's amazing platform, more relevant, engaging advertising experiences for consumers by leveraging some of your really cool components and the formats that Scope3 offers, paired with our dynamic data and messaging and different signals. So I guess in a nutshell, we help find, who to target, understand what consumers want, and predict where to find them. And that's all kind of based on search data.
Great. Okay. Well, let's get into the heart of the discussion then, sustainability. So what do you two make of the current state of sustainability in our industry? Gina, we'll start with you.
This is a big question because I think the industry it's constantly changing, and there's lots of different things that pop up, and I think that it's come such a long way in a short space of time. But also, a few years ago, sustainability wasn't even being talked about or spoken about as much as it is now, or even considered within the advertising industry. But in recent years, there's been a real significant increase in awareness about the environmental impact of our industry, but also brands and clients thinking about how they can be more environmentally sustainable. But as ever with our industry, as kind of challenges arise, and I know Joe was talking about GDPR and things like that, when these challenges arrive, the industry tends to kind of come together and band together and look at how we can solve these. And it's kind of moments like this where innovative companies are formed to help sustainable, enable sustainable solutions, such as Scope3, for example, with a mission to support the industry. And then I'll come on to talk about this a bit later, but there's also within the industry groups that have kind of formed, working groups and frameworks to support sustainable initiatives, which is kind of something that I think a lot of people are starting to lean into and adapt that kind of change. But yeah, of course, we're still at the early stages and there's definitely a lot more work to be done.
Yeah, definitely. And Gabi, any changes that you've seen over the past few years around this topic?
Certainly. I mean, I would echo everything that Gina just said. I started talking within the industry on this topic probably about 6 years ago. I've had like a transition all the way through from coming from a creative production background myself to talking to the industry about sustainability, 6-7 years ago, pre-COVID. And I think what's interesting to see is just the amount of education that's been absorbed by the industry in that time is huge. When I first started talking to people on the creative and the production side of the industry way back when about sustainability, initially people had no idea. So there was like a very strong sense that yes, the climate crisis was real and it was coming, but no one knew what to do. And everyone was like, do I recycle or is it just voting? Or I think that trajectory from something that's very opaque, I would say, into something that's really actionable has happened relatively fast. If you think how little time really has passed, and that's a lot down to increase in legislation, which I think is hugely valuable. I think that's very important to brands. I think that from the financial perspective, I think investors are very keen to know, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because your investments and the quality of your investments in the context of whether these things are resilient enough to deal with what's coming with the climate crisis, I think really important areas for people to be looking at. So I do think they're extremely important for brands. And so I think there was, like Gina was mentioning about like the ebbs and flows in our industry in terms of responsiveness, and definitely last year, it was like a big old fanfare about sustainability. And I think this year it was a little bit more muted. And so there was a phrase that Brian O'Kelly actually uses, like the trough of despair, the point where you've had the hype and then you have to go down into the trough where everyone realizes, oh, there's actually quite a lot of work for us to do now. What does that mean? And I think now we're coming up into productivity. And to me, that's the most exciting thing because it's the rational space to be. It's where the rubber hits the road. So I think we're actually in a really exciting space right now.
Okay, great. Gabi, staying with you, how does Scope3 actually measure the carbon footprint of advertising campaigns?
It's like the conversation earlier, like where do I start? It's a very, very big conversation. But I think, at a more sort of top level, the most important thing is the data. Like having the right data is vital in order to be able to measure campaigns properly. And what we have the advantage of doing, because we work as a very collaborative organization, we have partnerships with entities across the entire supply chain, all the way from the top to the bottom. Like we're working with you guys in Scope3 and we're measuring all the different aspects currently of the digital media supply chain, but I'll talk a bit later about how we're moving out of that space. And because we do that in a collaborative way, we're able to leverage real-time activity-based data from our partners, which means that we're actually putting together models that are using granular and comprehensive data to map what that supply chain looks like. It's a really unique opportunity that we have. And when you're the buy side looking in on what that looks like, we're able to say, look at our model. You can actually see in real time what's happening when you have publishers that are leaning in like Hearst, what happens when you have entities that are leaning in like Scope3 to actually show themselves up in that map, which I think is hugely valuable. So by having that mapping, by having that dynamic granular data where we're taking all of the different aspects of the industry and actually measuring what's happening in real time, we can give our buy-side partners just much more specific insights to enable them to take action so that they can decarbonize that activity.
Great. So Gina, how does Captify define sustainability in the context of your business? And how do you measure the environmental impact of your advertising efforts?
Big question. Like Gabi, I'll try and keep this top line because there's lots of different areas that we could touch on. And actually some of the things that Gabi kind of mentioned, we're already kind of looking into leveraging. But I guess if I was to kind of keep this top line, there's two different lenses, I suppose, that we kind of look through in terms of sustainability. The first is more holistically as a business. What is our environmental impact and what can we do as a business? And then I guess the second is kind of more tactile on a campaign basis with our partners and our clients in the industry. How can we support not only their goals, but also create solutions that can help them meet kind of their own sustainability criteria? So as you'd expect, we've looked at many different partners to find the right partners that can help do this. And going back to that first lens of kind of the business perspective, as an overall business level, we've partnered with Sidara, who are our global measurement partner, and they basically support us in measuring our Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions as a business. So analysing things like our server emissions or our office electricity, for example. But then not just measuring, but helping us to come up with strategies to help reduce those and kind of offset those as well. And then going back to that second lens, the kind of more tactile campaign client side, as a partner for our clients, we work with the likes of Scope3 and obviously Scope3, but Scope3 to help develop our green media product, which we launched earlier this year. And our GMP helps clients to, as Gabi said, eliminate the least helps us to basically run sustainable inventory across our media buyers and SSP partners and enable really low emission inventory so that they know that what they're delivering against can help them adopt a more sustainable practice while still delivering the most kind of high performance or high levels of performance across their creative. And then in addition, lastly, to the work that we're doing with Scope3 and Sidara, in-house and kind of internally, some of the efforts that we're doing, our product team has been able to re-optimize the way that we build out our cookieless segments. From some of the data we got back from Sidara, we could see that in the past, our data segments were responsible for a large proportion of AWS processing, but we've kind of adapted this and changed the way that we do this. And with that optimization, we've led to a reduction in carbon output from processing our cookieless data segments by about 44%. So that's just some of the ways that Captify is kind of tackling sustainability.
Yeah, it's great to hear about these steps and I think kind of opportunities to think about as well. So Gabi, could you provide examples of how your work has helped companies to reduce their carbon emissions?
Yeah, I think in terms of what it looks like to actually be able to decarbonize as you're going with a media campaign, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that when you're looking at things from a sustainability lens, and I'm sure, Gina, you've seen similar things with your own work, you often find that there are efficiencies there as well. So what can be not just a sustainability advantage also is providing like more effective campaigns because you're being much more efficient with the way that you're working. So we work with our brand and agency partners in order to be able to optimize their campaigns for low carbon and high performance media. And so to your point about like removing MFAs, for example, so we have things like our GMPs, as Gina mentioned, which are really great for our brand and agency partners, and also then the people that are working with them in order to be able to take out those layers of media inventory that's just not like valuable to them. And there's so much redundancy available to take from initially in the industry before we even get into the next areas of optimization. So this is like it's been really effective for us to be in this area already. And that leads to greater business outcomes as well, not just sustainability. And the example that I wanted to give was from a case study that we did earlier in this year, where we worked with Yahoo Advertising actually on a pilot that they were doing with one of their partners, USAA, the brand they were working with. And they worked with us again, and we were able to give them recommendations for decarbonisation. They worked with the tools and products that we had, like the GMPs, and they were actually able to make a 11% reduction across the emissions of their campaign, just that one campaign to pilot as a result of that work. And when you start looking at this ongoingly, so they've now adopted that as an ongoing process. And you imagine that happening at scale across the industry with all of our partners. Bit by bit, you can see how we could have a really significant impact on what digital advertising looks like as a carbon emitter within the advertising area.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, we've touched on it a little bit there, but Gina, how do you find the balance of kind of sustainability goals with your more advertising KPIs? Are you able to balance that effectively?
The $1,000,000 question. Ultimately, I guess we're definitely here to service, our clients and optimize towards their campaign goals. But I actually don't think that the two need to be mutually exclusive. It's definitely possible to do both. And actually, just talking about kind of case studies that Gabi did, we developed a case study recently with a global travel brand who were one of the first to run a GMP campaign with us. And their whole kind of goal was looking at increasing brand awareness, but they also wanted to reduce their carbon emissions. So we worked really closely with the client and our partners at Dentsu and used Scope3 to power the GMP product, GMP. And we were able to not only reduce our carbon emissions by 68% but we did this without having to compromise on any of the performance. They exceeded their BTR and also their viewability. In fact, in terms of viewability, I think we outperformed our viewability benchmark by something like 13%. So I don't think it needs to be one or the other. It's about finding that kind of balancing sweet spot and optimizing towards it.
Yeah. So sustainability often requires collaboration, as we're finding ourselves. How do you collaborate, Gabi, with kind of organizations, industry bodies, regulators to set and then promote sustainability standards?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Years back, I had a company that was a B Corp, and there is a sort of B Corp view of pre-competitive activity. And I think sustainability is a really good example. I think there's a lot of evidence in our industry of pre-competitive behaviors in order to ensure that we're collaborating to create an outcome that works for the industry as a whole across the board. So a really good example just from an industry level, obviously, is the work that was done with the Global Media Sustainability Framework with AdNet Zero, which we've been very engaged with, involved in the working groups, very much committed to having a framework that works for the industry as a whole. You can't do that on your own. You have to have the entire industry come together and put aside any competitive differences in order to be able to create structures that everyone can work inside. Because if we can't have like agreements about how things are measured, where things are measured, what reduction looks like, then it's impossible for us to actually do the work that needs to be done. So I think that collaboration is vital. And then obviously, I think, we have our collaborative sustainability platform. That's what we call our model and dashboard. That's the space where we invite people in to work and to decarbonize their media campaigns. So to us, collaboration is very much baked into how we work. And so collaborating with, well, frankly, almost all the people on this call, but like collaborating with many of the entities already in this space, because as we work together, everyone is able to create this ecosystem where we are being sustainable, running businesses that work, and actually proving that you can be like financially sustainable and sustainable at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. And then Gina, what partnerships or collaborations have you formed to promote sustainability?
Well, very similar to Gabi actually, but as kind of mentioned already, we are working with two partners to support our sustainability goals. Sidara from an overall business perspective, but then Scope3, who we've partnered with to develop and support our green media product solution. But as Gabi said, on top of this, there are a number of different industry bodies and partners that have had to come together to collaborate, such as AdNet Zero and IAB. And we've worked really closely with the IAB Sustainability Working Group. And they are basically creating an environmental sustainable FAQ initiative, such a mouthful, which basically aims to make sure that environmental credentials are more accessible, and they provide efficient resources for people who are assessing potential partners or clients looking at different sustainability efforts. So there's a huge amount of collaboration going on in the industry, but just making sure that we're kind of leaning into those, and it's not that competitive kind of aspect to it, like Gabi said.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So scalability is something that I wanted to touch on a little bit. Gabi, do you have any upcoming innovations or tools that you're developing to kind of reduce the carbon impact of digital ads, and how are you planning to scale those solutions?
Yes, always. It's to the point about where the rubber is hitting the road. What we've seen in the last 12 months at Scope3 is an increased awareness that decarbonisation is possible. So it started off with people just wanting to be able to report, but the recognition that we have, where are we now? I hate saying this because every time I say this, I get mortified by the numbers going down. But by 2030, according to Joe Biden, there is an expectation that globally we reduce our emissions by 50%. That is a wild thing to imagine, especially when we have Gen AI now and the emissions associated with that skyrocketing. So it is absolutely vital. And I think it is really exciting to see across brands that there is this drive now for how do we decarbonize? It's not enough to report. We actually start removing the carbon from our processes. So we feel a very strong pull from the industry to keep expanding our product as quickly as possible in order to meet those needs. So yes, we are building into that market need. So there are a few things that we're doing. One of them is that we are going to be surfacing the GMSF, the Global Media Sustainability. That's a mouthful too, isn't it? The Global Media Sustainability Framework. We're going to surface that in our UI as well, so that people can start understanding what that looks like, how it works, and how it can begin to become incorporated into how measurement happens. As a framework, it's not yet there. We always knew it was V1, but it's getting there. So we felt it was really important to start getting people acclimatized to it, socialized to being able to see how that works whilst using our current emission factors. So that's one of the things that we're doing in order to support the industry and to really sort of gear everyone up towards frameworks and standards becoming a norm. And then obviously in the space of the GMSF, omnichannel, there is digital advertising. It's a vast and extremely important part of the advertising media supply chain and creative digital advertising. But there is also that beyond it. So we're working on omnichannel. And then obviously the bit that's close to my heart, which is we're also working on R&D right now on our creative products. So what does it look like for us to support entities like Scope3 in being able to measure the creativity and what they're doing, but also the stage beyond that with production, so that brands can see end to end what's coming along as they do their media campaigns. So we are working in that direction over the next few months.
Got you. Gina, how's it going? What kind of challenges have you faced in integrating sustainable practices, and how have you overcome them?
Yeah, it's funny. I think with all new initiatives, and we've all been in the industry long enough to see these kind of crop up, but there's always going to be initial teething problems and challenges. And I think for us, one of the biggest challenges that we've come up against is, I think, education. And I've heard that word kind of thrown around a couple of times today, but helping to educate our partners and our clients, but also with that, there's like an element of, I guess, changing perception. We as an industry are so focused on ROI, and sustainability can sometimes come across like a bit of an afterthought. So it's vital that we work on changing that perception. And the ways that we're doing this are, as mentioned, we're part of the IAB Sustainability Working Group, but also I think more tactile and more reactive than that is things like lunch and learns with our clients to help educate them and give them the tools to educate one another, make informed decisions that kind of implement changes across their strategy. But also, as Gabi said, keeping up with frameworks and standards and solutions as they're rolled out. It's not enough just to be measuring, it's actually optimizing and reducing that carbon. And that's kind of the biggest challenge that we're coming up against at the moment.
Another big question. So in the broader context, what role do you see digital advertising playing in the corporate sustainability movement as a whole? Gabi, I'll come to you on this one.
Yeah, sure. I think about this probably far too much. So I come from creative production. In fact, where I started out was I co-founded an initiative called Green the Bid, which was in order to decarbonize the production end of the industry. And there was a phrase that was given to me by someone who I was talking with that I found really impactful. He talked about boating, and I've never been boating in my life. So just to be clear, I'm going off what someone else said. But when you have a boat and you have a rudder, the weight of the water on the rudder is far too much for you to be able to move the rudder itself. So there's a thing called a trim tab inside the rudder, which is like a mini rudder that operates that way. So the trim tab, if you turn the trim tab turns the rudder, and the rudder turns the boat. And I feel like, having come from the creative production end of the industry, which is an area of emissions, into the digital media end of the industry, which is obviously a massive area of emissions within our industry, and then you have everything beyond that, I feel like we are a trim tab, right? So there is an enormous role, I think, for digital advertising in the decarbonization of everything. If you consider that we are the monetization model for the internet and probably Gen AI as things move forwards, being that monetization model gives us an enormous amount of influence in that space. And if we can be the trim tab by decarbonizing ourselves and the lighthouse to show how it can be done, I think beyond the scope of our own emissions, I think there's huge value that we can bring to industry as a whole with the differences that we make.
Definitely. Yeah. Boating enthusiasts loving the analogy. But what we could all understand. So like and then just to wrap up now, I'd love to hear from both of you on this. One piece of advice for companies that are looking to become a bit more sustainable. Gina, maybe we'll start with you first.
Only one piece. I can think of lots of advice to companies around sustainability. I think if I had to cherry pick one, prioritize long-term commitment over short-term wins. Sustainability is a long-term commitment, but it doesn't need to be a huge mountain that you need to climb tomorrow. I think if companies start with small, manageable steps, that will lead to a greater systematic change within your company. Sustainable change is often gradual if you think about the changes in the last couple of years, but companies that prioritize long-term goals can ensure that sustainability is really at the core, embedded within their DNA. And that consistent small steps effort will create a deeper, more kind of impactful meaning.
Yeah, it's a good one. Gabi, how about you? Same question.
I love that answer. So I 100% agree with that. The other thing is, I think that planning is really important. So one of the things I love about what Scope3 is building is that there is an ecosystem there that allows for a virtuous cycle. So by looking and modeling what your emissions may look like, making planning in order to be able to minimize your emissions, running your media plan, discovering your reporting, and going again. I mean, to your point about incremental change, Gina, I think that continuous virtuous cycle, so that it becomes second nature to us, I think is so important, because to get to those long-term goals, you need to be able to look at what you're doing, make adaptations, and change. That iterative model is so common to how business runs now. So I think being willing to plan up front rather than like doing it and discovering later, I think is very, very impactful. So model first, then report.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you both so much for your insights and for leading the way and making digital ads more sustainable. If anyone wants to learn more about fast-loading ads, Scope3 measurement in Celtra, then you can reach out to your customer success manager. But for now, I'll hand back to Kelly.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. And thank you, Gina and Gabi. That was a super insightful session.